Look, I have a couple of fears before we can even answer that question. One of them is I still don't expect a peaceful transfer of power. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's going to be peaceful. I think there's going to be some instability, God forbid, some crisis, riots.
They're planning it on Wednesday. It's like there's been an Evite for the riot. You know what I mean?
Evite for the riot, right? Eventbrite. Are you going to show up with your riot gear as a citizen? I mean, I'm not trying to make light of it. I think millions of people are very angry and upset. But this is also an administration that uses, populist unrest in its interest. And I think eventually there will be a Biden administration in the White House, but the country's going to go through what might be some scary and bloody times before that happens. God forbid. I hope I'm wrong. I haven't been wrong yet. I predicted this instability back in July and August, and it's unfortunately coming true.
I'm glad that you're saying that, because I just spoke to John Nichols right before, and he said that he didn't see that it would lead to a big nothing. And I'm thinking, I don't think so. I think one person dying is not a big nothing. Not that they've died yet, but implementing the Proud Boys and these other folks to come out in Washington, D.C. The mayor of D.C. is saying, please do not come out and counter-protest these protesters. They have uncovered, you probably know all this already. I'm saying it maybe for the benefit of the audience who's just coming to this information. They have uncovered, talking with people on these different back channels, they're wanting to smuggle in large caches of weapons into the DC area, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. It's, this isn't, I don't think it's something that you can excuse. And then today on the just dismiss. Today on the Washington Post morning report, they talked about how, Donald Trump has flirted with martial law for a long time, and if he's able to have a reason to call it, right, then he could create the reason himself by having his Proud Boys, show up for their boogaloo. Not to again mix metaphors between the two groups, the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys. It's all boys. Anyway, your thoughts about the upcoming?
I mean, I'm very concerned, and so I guess what I would say is, even if there is a peaceful transfer of power with millions of Americans persuaded that the Biden administration is not legitimate or wasn't elected legitimately, that is already a crisis for our country. Like, we're already in kind of banana republic culture of warring factions instead of a beautiful system that has created consensus and agreement, even with those who didn't win for, since 1776. So that's problematic. But I would say I'm going to put a line in the sand here, and you can see if I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Unfortunately, I'm always right about these predictions. We have, and the Democrats especially, have played into the hands of a president who might want to declare martial law, because there are emergency measures across the country in state after state due to the coronavirus. In my state, New York State, Andrew Cuomo keeps, not based on the science, extending emergency law, extending a state of emergency. As someone who has studied and written about the closing of democracies, a state of emergency is the most dangerous thing to have, because no one ever gives up emergency powers without a fight. And usually it's a bloody fight, a civil war. But B, once you cross that bar of saying, well, here in New York, we've got emergency powers. Here in California, we're under emergency edicts, and laws are being laid down without, due process or oversight. Then what we've set up is for the president to say, pandemic, emergency. It's too dangerous to have a transition of power. It's there's a state of emergency. You said it yourselves, Democrats. I'm just going to stay here and look after this horrible medical emergency that you've all said I was ignoring. Sorry, I'm not going to vacate. I hope I'm wrong, but I cannot stress enough. And I know this is a real medical emergency. I don't mean to belittle it at all. But never before in a pandemic of the worst kind have we suspended the rule of law, in this scale with no oversight, and created a massive global, suppression of the rule of law and due process of law due to the medical emergency. It has never happened, no matter how much you're messaged that this is a quarantine. It's not a quarantine. This is a suppression of freedoms of circulation, freedoms of speech, freedoms of assembly that are constitutionally guaranteed on a North Korea level scale. Never happened before in America, not in the Spanish flu, not in the cholera epidemic, not with tuberculosis, not with HIV, never, 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 because it's unconstitutional. That's why it doesn't happen. So given that we've already basically tenderized the rule of law, as people in the military would say about an enemy, when you're trying to wear down an enemy, you tenderize, you harass, you weaken the enemy. It's already weak. So if the president says, you all are running by emergency edict, I'm going to run by emergency edict. We have already opened the barn door and let that horse out. I'm really scared about it.
It's not like there's one party that you can look to, because the Democrats are more complicit at the lockdowns and the emergency powers than the Republicans, who are, they don't believe in science, which is a problem, but they also have let their states be open, but then a lot of people are dying there. It's very complicated to preserve democracy in the face of a pandemic, as it turns out.
Respectfully, Juliana, I have to say I don't agree with you. I know that a lot of people, including people I love, are getting so much messaging that that's the case, that they believe it. But it's not at all difficult to preserve democracy in the case of a pandemic. We've done it over and over and over. This could be subject of another, discussion. I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole.
No, it's okay. I'm enjoying the conversation. I think the viewers are as well.
Okay, good. Well, the science is now, very, there's many peer-reviewed studies saying that lockdown doesn't work. And there are peer-reviewed studies saying that lockdown does work. And specific policies that are being laid down by emergency order, like, let's just say, all the restaurants in New York State being closed down, by edict of Andrew Cuomo, not by the assembly, not by the elected, representatives having a debate in an open parliamentary process or, state assembly process, but just Andrew Cuomo said no more restaurants, right? The science doesn't back that up. It doesn't. Like, one study, that was overseen by China, came out with that a year ago. But the lawyer I just spoke to, who's representing the small business owners in Staten Island, says, and he's right, that there are studies that show that that's not an accurate way to deal with a pandemic. And same thing with universities, same thing with churches. Like the Supreme Court ruled that Andrew Cuomo was wrong to close the churches. And, theoretically, you could do this forever. You could say forever, because 70,000 people died of pneumonia in 2017. Pathogens exist. Respiratory diseases exist. I don't mean to minimize it. But what's the exit strategy, right? There are always going to be people dying of respiratory diseases because we're human beings. And this is a particularly bad one. And I get that there need to be, some emergency measures. But in a working democracy, you have limited emergency measures subject to legal oversight. They don't go on forever. And they cannot go on when the science doesn't support them. So what I'm seeing is that, first of all, a lot of scientists, like Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, signer of the Great Barrington Declaration, I'm interviewing him later, many scientists and physicians and epidemiologists are coming out saying the lockdowns are doing more harm physically to populations than coronavirus.
Oh, yeah. My doctor with my pediatrician was like, I've seen the kids, they can't move their muscles. They're basically just laying around watching TV all day long, especially kids in places like, New York or some larger cities where you give up indoor space to live in the city, or that's just where you live or whatever. There's just not a lot of room. So what are you going to do all day? We have that problem.
These are not trivial questions. These are incredibly important questions. The BBC announced that there were wards full of children, and the New York Times reported it. This was 2 days ago. They had to retract it. And then the nurse who made that claim retracted it because it turns out that children are not at risk in the way that we thought initially, and should be in school, should be playing, should be in playgrounds. I've been drilling into death.
What would be the approach? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I could talk all day. You should interrupt me.
No, I really like what you said about how, the messaging, because I'm always about what my own particular interest as a media professor is the messaging and who does it benefit, right? So what messaging are we buying, and what would a sane, I'm hearing what you're saying. What would a sane response to this pandemic have looked like?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. Like? First of all, I can answer that. Well, first of all, who's it benefiting? Unfortunately, what's happening right now is a massive transfer of wealth from sole proprietors, entrepreneurs, small business people, mom and pop shops to 6 corporations. That's what's happening. So it's a massive intervention in capitalism, which is why the people who are most alarmed right now are on the left, and well, actually more on the right and in the center than on the left, who doesn't realize how serious it is to have a centrally planned economy in which oligarchs get to decide.
The far left understands, but the regular left is too busy with the other issues.
Well, which is intentional to distract us.
Exactly. God, I feel like I've known you forever. Yeah.
We're just friends in another lifetime and reconnecting in this lifetime. But so basically what's happened is, since the pandemic and since these lockdown policies that really often don't make any epidemiological sense, but they serve to drive people online, right? Tech entrepreneurs have gained $27 billion in those few top companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Palantir. And so basically I run it, I'm CEO of a tiny tech company. There are 2 business models for digital businesses. One is we harvest your data. The other is we entertain you to keep your eyeballs on the site to sell advertising. So these tech companies have created a pandemic response that takes your poor child, keeps him or her at home, drives him or her online. Every minute he or she is online, harvests the data. It's valuable, sells advertising. And instead of face-to-face contact, which has been forbidden, instead of going to church or to bookstores or shopping with cash on Main Street and keeping those little businesses afloat, going to a bar, being careful, sitting in a distanced way, washing your hands, not breathing on people close up, all of which is possible, right? It's all forbidden. So you are driven online. Who benefits? Every minute you're online, you're minting money for the tech companies. And they're the ones who, interestingly, have the contracts to present COVID data to people. So those big COVID maps.
Sorry. Sorry. We're fucked. Oh,
we're fucked. Unless we start to demand real data, we are fucked, because I run a digital dashboard. You can tell any story with a digital dashboard with data, and you're not even lying. You can dial it up, dial it down, make sure, tell the code to count on, once a week instead of every day. You get a spike, right? Or tell it to count cough and fever the way they do in Oregon. You'll get a spike. These numbers are meaningless, especially because they're being presented by people who benefit from lockdowns, the same companies. There's something called the COVID-19 Response Project, which was started very early on to message about coronavirus. Who funds it? Google, Microsoft, NASDAQ, Nintendo, Zoom.
Oh, yeah, Nintendo loves it if you just stay home on your ass playing Nintendo all day. Yes.
Mince money for these.
Zoom!
Zoom, right? Zoom. And the other thing is, what does Zoom do? Every company is now discussing their IP and their plans and their strategies on Zoom. Zoom is not owned by the United States government. Zoom is not secure. So basically, other companies that are not our friends are harvesting all of our IP, all of our ideas, and just exploiting the fact that we're all doing all our business on Zoom. So that's number one. But there's very dark. There are dark outcomes. Amazon, right? Why would Amazon want to message about coronavirus? Well, if you kill all of Amazon's competitors by, epidemiologically, how does it make sense to kill in New York State little stores, little grocery stores, little mom and pop shops, little boutiques, and say you can't shop there, but you can all herd your, massive populations into Target and Walmart. And you can't eat at a restaurant, but McDonald's can stay open, right? And Amazon can still deliver, crushing people together in their warehouses. It makes no epidemiological sense. And you can see the same intervention in real estate. And I'm actually talking to a lawyer about suing Andrew Cuomo as a tiny landlady in the state of New York. It's so valuable to be able to say, oh, look, a hotspot in Williamsburg, right? We're just going to have an edict that drives small landlords out of business because they can't afford to hold on while there's a moratorium on any commercial activity that under ordinary circumstances would say, okay, I hear that you can't pay your rent. I'm really sorry about that, but you have to go somewhere less expensive now. They've intervened in normal capitalism, so that doesn't happen. Who can afford to wait it out? Institutional investors in real estate. So they're targeting as hotspots this sexiest neighborhoods in Brooklyn that are not owned by institutional investors, interestingly by, Hasidim and other, groups of not institutional investors, driving the prices down, emptying out those cities. And then when it's all over, right, and it doesn't make epidemiological sense, right? When it's all over, only the institutional investors will be able to snap up that property, and they're going to do it cents on the dollar. So you're seeing a massive transfer of wealth under the guise of nonsensical coronavirus policy. So what would make sense? I think the Great Barrington Declaration makes a lot of sense. It's a bunch of very distinguished scientists who and epidemiologists who note that most people of most age groups, except the very elderly, really are not at serious risk from this virus. So it basically says, let everyone go about their business and shield the people who are especially at risk. I'm not an epidemiologist, but also as a civil libertarian, dying isn't the only, you could lock down everyone forever and save lives, right? And people try to
kill themselves.
Sorry?
People are killing themselves because they're lonely. This is
well, absolutely. I mean, and people are starting to say this who are very distinguished, but the mainstream media is marginalizing them. They're saying, look at drug addiction. Right now in New York State, I did the math. There's more of a chance of dying of a drug overdose or suicide than coronavirus in my state, in my county. And if you look at the death tables for these states like Oregon, California, New York that are locking down, people are dying. Young people are dying of drug overdoses and suicide out of despair, out of depression, out of, joblessness, an inability to feed their kids. I mean, it's catastrophic. They're in the top 10 causes of death, and you really have to drill down to even find coronavirus in the top 10 causes of death. So, not to mention, like you talked about your child, I'm a stepmother. I don't want to single out, any child, but I see the trauma that these little kids are going through, not seeing human faces. This is not trivial, right? Kids are not at substantial risk from getting really sick from coronavirus, but they're being kept from socializing. They're being kept from reading emotional cues. They're turning into little robots. They're depressed. They're hopeless. Young adults are hopeless and depressed. These have huge mental health outcomes, huge physical health outcomes. What suppresses your immunity? Stress, depression, right? Suicidality. I mean, and so very distinguished people are starting to say this. So basically in a free society, when you have a medical emergency, you create more capacity. It's nonsensical that because you may not have enough hospitals, you lock everyone down. No, in a free society, that's a rich society, you create more medical capacity and you support healthcare workers, which we didn't see in this bill, as you just noticed. And you do what we did in the HIV pandemic, which is, education, mobilization, getting people the medical care that they need. early on, people said, lock up HIV positive people, make sure they don't have sex with anyone, strip them of their civil liberties, invade their privacy to inform their sex partners. And rightly, the LGBTQ community said, no, that is a violation of their rights as human beings. And so the LGBTQ community managed the HIV pandemic, voluntarily educating people. This is how you have safe sex. This is how you have responsible sex. This is how you don't pass on this dangerous pathogen. And many people died, and it's very sad, but people did not end up in a police state in which HIV positive people were second-class citizens with medical passports. And that was the right way to handle a serious crisis in a free society.
How much of this was just capitalizing on a pandemic? Because some of this march toward surveillance and police state and lockdowns was already happening before the pandemic just gave us a good reason that people will believe to, stay home. Because I was there in New York when it was first happened and everyone was terrified. You didn't really know if it was a breathing thing or if you touched it, it would go in and kill you. But that sense of terror seems to continue on in liberal enclaves beyond New York City, where even, we know more about how you get it, which is droplets, of breathing in and out. And that seems to have not even been taken into the conversation around how we're responding.
Right. Well, Juliana, you're asking all the right questions. Again, I don't want to minimize the seriousness of the disease, but again, respiratory illness is always very serious for people who are compromised. Again, 70,000 people, let's wrap our brains around this, died of pneumonia in 2017. And what the CDC is doing right now is folding something called PIC they've invented, pneumonia, influenza, coronavirus. So to, really, I think, highlight or showcase the coronavirus deaths, they are folding in these other categories of respiratory disease that do kill people. They kill the elderly. They kill people with compromised immune systems. They kill people with diabetes. Respiratory pathogens are always serious, but we've managed as a free society to not close down everything when there's a bad flu season or bad pneumonia season. As serious as that is, I don't want to minimize it. So what you're asking is, weren't these always, waiting to be mobilized? And I would say, you and I both know that I wrote the book, The End of America, in 2008, when the invisible enemy was terrorism. And as I said there, you take 10 steps to close an open society. Number one, invoke a terrifying internal and external threat. Well, for 12 years, the powers that be tried to take the serious problem of terrorism, right, which really did kill some people, in very scary ways, and to turn it into an absolutely debilitating, universal, nightmare every minute, terrorist under your bed, sleeper cells, red, orange, yellow alert, which, may be familiar because they're doing it again with coronavirus. And they tried and tried and tried to say this is enough of a reason to strip everyone of their civil liberties, create a surveillance state, and, burn up the Constitution. And it took a lot of work, and I was one of the people working on this, but they didn't succeed, right? Enough people realized that this is a serious problem, but they're hyping it, right? It is being exploited. So they needed a new enemy. And as, I think that this is a real pandemic, but, Naomi Klein and others have rightly pointed out that real crises bring opportunists. And that was true in Haiti, and it was true in Katrina, and it's true, with terrorism. There, every crisis brings opportunists. So these track and trace programs, as I mentioned, lots of interests, like coronavirus statistics being presented. Increasingly, they're being presented by biosecurity entities in Britain and in the United States. Like Palantir handles biosecurity, right? And they're in charge of our coronavirus statistics. The same is true in the UK. Biosecurity. Well, the powers that be, both private, for-profit, and governmental, really have wanted to create a surveillance state for a long time. They don't like people like you and me being able to meet in a house and have a private conversation, because that means that no one group can consolidate power. So this is a dream come true. I mean, I'll tell you, my husband and I fled New York on March 11th when Broadway shut down, because both of us, he's a former military guy and I've been in conflict areas as a journalist. We both knew that, you know, we both know what a destabilizing situation looks like, where the rule of law is about to be suspended. So we're like, we're out of here. But the reason I knew something terrible was coming was that I Airbnb my little cottage upstate, and someone from Apple said, we want to rent it for a month, maybe longer, because of a project that we've been working on.
You're like, no, I'm going to live there, but you're scaring me.
Okay.
You're like, no, I'm going to live there.
No, exactly. I mean, when I got that call, I thought, and this was at the very beginning of the pandemic, I thought, okay, tech companies have a vested interest in the outcome of this crisis. It's going to be bad. And we fled New York, and it was bad because what you've got is a real crisis being exploited and hyped and messaged about by people who are corrupted by the money to be made. And the last thing I want to say, it's bad. The media, right? My kids, and I mean, not just my kids, I should say their whole generation, my mom, my loved ones, all of them read, you know, the New York Times, the Guardian. But yes, thank you, Juliana. That's a huge
money. Yeah.
You know, Bill Gates has been plowing money into the Guardian Media Lab, you know, millions of dollars. You know, the New York Times, there was a big expose about this. I believe it was in the Atlantic, but the Gates Foundation has been funding through, you know, labs and, you know, kind of getting around the paywall, the separation of advertising and editorial. You know, media companies are desperate. You know that journalism can barely pay its bills anymore. And so you get these gigantic interests to come around and say, well, let me just, you know, give you PBS $50 million for educational research. They're not going to say this guy is a criminal and he's in league with criminals, and they're suppressing everyone's rights because they want to manage populations, deploy a vaccine that's poorly tested. You know, I'm not even going to go down that rabbit hole, but, you know, none of it is unfolding with a free media critical of the, you know, messaged science. I mean, it gets so granular, like this COVID-19 project, which was funded by these for-profits. They funnel money through the Blavatnik School in Oxford. The Blavatnik School creates a COVID map, and the New York Times displays that COVID map. And the data that the New York Times is displaying is completely corrupted. It comes from, you won't believe it, it comes from like hedge fund data. No. It comes from unnamed volunteers, and they don't have an ombudsman to answer for the fact that they don't post the data sets. You can't verify the data. Individual citizen journalists are looking at what the New York Times is reporting, comparing it to local health department numbers, and it's inflated by a factor of hundreds for each state. So the messaging we're getting is very, very corrupted by these interests that benefit from the lockdown.
It's very interesting because they have a really good, you know, if you're trying to be responsible, you think the responsible thing to do is stay home, this will be over soon, wear a mask, etc. And then you have people who are fighting for their rights around mask wearing and not mask wearing, which seems to actually play in to the whole narrative that is a larger removal of all of our civil rights. Did I read that right?
I mean, Juliana, I love you so much for noticing these things, because what we're encouraged to do right now, as we were encouraged to do with terrorism, is engage in very black and white binary thinking. You know, and it's being politicized and moralized, right? If you don't want to wear a mask every minute, you're a crazy Trump supporter trying to kill people with your breath. And, you know, if you're a decent person, you'll wear a mask in your sleep, right? That's how we're being encouraged to think. And I can tell you as a student of history, when a disease is moralized, bad things happen, right? As someone pointed out, on my Twitter feed recently, if you die of pneumonia, it's just something really unfortunate that happens. But if you die of coronavirus, someone has killed you. But there are pathogens, you know, in the human population, and we shouldn't moralize them. We should think critically about them. So right now, in Massachusetts, there's a mandate, which I need to look at, because what is a mandate in a free society, that says that you have to wear a mask in public. Well, you know, again, that is not epidemiologically useful. Out there is a big waterfront with no human beings, and you know, an opportunity for exercise and fresh air. And you literally are breaking the law if you take your mask off in public with no human being around you for, you know, hundreds and hundreds of feet, or visibly, or anywhere. And what is in public? In a park, on a ship, you know, like it's not epidemiological. Like, I would respect a law that said wear a mask within 6 feet of people, or wear a mask if you can't social distance. But so we've got little tiny kids out on rail trails, you know, 4-year-olds with masks. They can't breathe, and they think that this is normal. They can't read, you know, human emotions. And you and I grew up breathing fresh air. A generation is going to grow up thinking the state has the power to control their breathing or control what they put on their faces. So that's not trivial, but it's also not even epidemiologically sound. And you see that over and over. So people who are saying, as the governor in South Dakota is saying, it's not the government's business to legislate about what businesses can open or close. She's being hated. She's, you know, getting death threats. But it turns out that a lot of studies are coming in showing that states that didn't forcibly close businesses, didn't have mask mandates, have pretty much the same outcomes as states that did. So you do have to start to ask, given this, is it America when, you know, the governor of Massachusetts, with no science, can tell me that I cannot take a walk miles from another human being without, you know, a mandated, you know, covering over my face? Like, I am not a crazy Trump supporter. I didn't vote for him, but I know that once the state has the power to tell you what you do with your body, you know, even when you're not hurting anyone else, it is a very bad historical precedent. And next, I promise you, and they're already pushing for it, is the, you know, vaccine tattoos, or the, you know, you're a second-class citizen. My poor, you know, I'm not going to name names, but children I love are forced to get flu shots to go back to school. That's not even a coronavirus thing, but the state has stepped into the role of parents. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I vaccinated my children. But I spoke to a mom in Massachusetts whose kid has seizures, and she's begging the doctor of her child for a letter to the school to explain that this will just endanger her child. This is just the state messaging that the state can do whatever it wants. Curfews. How is that epidemiologically sound? You crowd more people into a smaller number of hours. But no, it's an exertion of the power of the state, an exertion of the power of the state. And, you know, absolutely what is happening is that more and more people are being beaten down, exhausted, giving up, depressed, alcoholic, you know, unable to mobilize, unable to convene, unable to even discuss ousting these people in private. And the state is aggregating all the powers it always wanted, along with 6 rich guys who do not have our best interests at heart.
Naomi Wolf, I could talk to you all day, and I'm really grateful that you came on, and I'm also grateful that you allowed me to have pretty much a whole second conversation with you about what's going on today. Your voice is so important, and I do really, really, again, appreciate you coming on, and I hope that we'll be able to work together. Again, Naomi Wolf is an author, journalist, a former political advisor to Gore and Bill Clinton. Her most recent book is Outrages, Sex Censorship, and the Criminalization of Love. Naomi, name the book that has you mentioned it earlier, and the title is slipping my mind. Your book about, you know, that we're sliding into authoritarianism.
Sure. Thank you. The End of America.
Right.
And its sequel, Give Me Liberty. So,
Give Me Liberty, yes.
Such a pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate it. And thank you for letting me speak to your wonderful community as well.
And the project Daily Clout, where can we find that?
dailyclout.io. my friend, and check it out.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously.
Likewise. Take care.
You're watching ACT.TV. I'm Juliana Forlano. Leave your comments in the little space below this video on YouTube. I look forward to reading them because we had such a long discussion that there's so many things you can comment on. So thank you so much. Again, I'm Juliana Forlano. You can follow ACT.TV across platforms. You can follow me on Twitter. You can follow Naomi Wolf. We had it up there on the screen already. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great